Let me just start off by saying welcome to everybody. My name's Sarah Kupke. I'm Head of Professional Learning at ECIS. And on behalf of the whole ECIS team, I'd like to say that it's my very great honor to welcome Al-Jawhara Al-Thani to today's ECIS Canversation. My thanks to the many people who are joining us on the call, because they're coming in now as I'm speaking, and of course to those who'll be calling it up later. It's a recorded conversation. In particular, my thanks to Cynthia Bolton, Manager of Learning 365 at the Qatar Foundation, who introduced me to Al-Jawhara Al-Thani. Jawhara is the Head of Wellbeing and Safeguarding at the Qatar Foundation, with a background in sociology of education. Is that right? Yeah, so with a background in sociology of education and cultural studies, Al-Jawhara's work focuses on the importance of unpacking bias and creating opportunities to develop authentic relationships with the community and the context in which schools operate. In TEDx talks in 2015 and 2018, Al-Jawhara asks provoking questions such as, how can we graduate students who will be active contributors to the growth and the development of our country if we've not given them the tools to understand their country's needs? How might education focus on why we learn rather than what we learn? Or why are we constantly reforming education only to rebuild old systems somewhere else? In an ECIS course during February, just coming up now, starting right at the beginning next week, Al-Jawhara will be talking about child protection in the context of intercultural communication or cultural relativism. She'll be reflecting on the importance of developing our sensitivities about how to explore and balance different perspectives surrounding our understanding of abuse and our obligation to keep students safe. This opens the door to conversations about our own cultural biases and the ways that we can move forward in partnership with our school community. So Jawhara, welcome. I wonder if you could start by telling us a bit about yourself and just set the context for the work that you do.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that introduction. So my name is Al-Jawhara and I'm the Head of Safeguarding and Wellbeing at Qatar Foundation. I've been with the Qatar Foundation for 6 years in the education realm. And I have always been fascinated by who we are in the educational space. And that's what drew me to the idea of sociology, because failure and success in those spaces seemed contingent on a lot of things that were outside academic ability. So I was always interested in sort of our social and cultural capital going into these spaces and what that means for our personal experiences. And I think working in an international education setting and attending international schools, you start to learn a little bit about the performativity that it takes to be successful in these spaces. And when I started really thinking about bias and creating space around having conversations about our expectations from one another. And that eventually organically drew me towards child protection, because it was one of those spaces where a misunderstanding can create a lot of tension and a lot of issues within your school community. And it is also one of those spaces where if you transplant a particular system or a particular approach and it doesn't take, the consequences are huge. So it's not something that you want to walk into very lightly. And then the question becomes, the question about who does this system serve and what does this education that we're providing our students, what does it serve? How does it serve these students? It becomes a lot more high stakes when you're talking about things around social emotional learning and when you're talking about child protection. And there's a saying that systems can't fail those who they were never designed to protect. And I think that is incredibly powerful and incredibly true when it comes to safeguarding and child protection. And what I found when I started, when I took my first training, is that I walked into a space and I heard all this incredible information. and all of these things about what you're supposed to do. And it was very procedural. It was very clear. And when I started as a child protection officer, I found that the reality of that was the complete opposite. So it was not very clear. There was a lot of ambiguity around situations. And because our communities sometimes are very small and very intertwined, there's a lot of unpacking that needs to go in to what it means to, keep things confidential, or to honor a student's disclosure, but also not promise confidentiality when you've worked years to build, particular relationships. So that became something that I was really drawn to, is that I was attending really incredible trainings, but they were very far removed from the day-to-day reality that we were encountering. And there was a lot of learning that happened on the job. And so just thinking back to my own sociology, education, and I just found that I was struggling to find a discussion around the intersectionality of child protection, because it's not something that's insular. It is not something that exists in one domain. There's the political element, the legal element, the health element, the mental health element as well that comes into that health piece. You have your community engagement, and then there's that social, cultural, political capital that different people are bringing from their own context and using to interpret all of those things. And in the trainings that I've attended, I found that the discussion is child protection, but there's no discussion of that intersectionality and all the other resources that you need to draw upon to really understand your context. So that's something that I've been trying to, develop and understand over the last 4 years that I've had this position as a child protection officer. And that's really what brings me here today, is that lens.
I'd love to explore that a little bit further later on. But just thinking about the community in which you work, the Qatar Foundation, let's just think about those intercultural assumptions for a minute. How do you carve out spaces for conversations within your foundation for conversations about intercultural assumptions?
One of the things that we've done over the last 4 years is really develop our onboarding and initiation. So all of our orientations for our staff, we've tried to build in a space and place to discuss some of those assumptions and bias. And I think when I first joined the foundation, there was a lot of sort of what you would get in a welcome packet to any country of like, these are the foods that people eat and this is what they wear. And that's wonderful and beautiful. And there's time and place for that to be celebrated, but that's not what happens in the classroom. That's not what happens in those real life exchanges that you have with people. So elevating that conversation to something beyond, food and culture and that very superficial kind of view of culture, and understanding a deeper understanding of culture became more important. So understanding family units, understanding what relationships look like, understanding what, people come from all around the world where their family unit may look very different, and so even when we write policy, a lot of policies are written as the parents, but the parents aren't always the people who are the primary caregivers in different cultures around the world, or that network may be wider. So there may be uncles involved, there may be nannies involved, and there may be a lot of different people that also play a role. And it's really important to go in that without judgment, without assuming that everyone will be like you. So that was one of the things that I felt was very impactful, is that understanding the history of the country in a more robust way and the way that it's developed. So for example, our first school in Qatar opened in 1949, which is living memory for some people, and not very long ago by the grand scheme of things. And the first girls' school opened a few years after that. So when Brown versus Board of Education was happening in the US, we were opening our first girls' school. And these things, just to frame out time and to make people understand that the complexity of development that has to happen in such a short amount of time, really helps you understand the willingness of a community also to grow and develop. So again, it's good to understand and contextualize the culture and community that you're working with beyond just that superficial welcome packet. We like to eat this and we dress this way.
That's so interesting. And so when you talk about the family units, that's really interesting because as you say, it may not just be the parents that are the caregivers for the children. How do you involve the families? How do you involve the wider family or the carers of the children in the educational process?
Well, one of the things that we were very mindful of when our first iteration of the policy that we wrote was to make sure that we're not just adopting that language that says parents, so parents, guardians, caregivers. So we always encourage, our teachers to talk to whoever it is that comes to pick up their child. That person is responsible for that child. They're here, they're picking them up. You have to talk to them, engage with them, make sure that you're having that dialogue, because people assume that it's only the parent that can make a decision or influence this child's life. But if this person is with that child, you also serves to kind of bring them into the conversation. And I think being very mindful of that. And when we have, for example, the child protection situation, we always think about, who do we know? Who do we know in this family? Who do we have a relationship with? Who has a relationship with the child? And we really think critically about the network around the child, and not just, this is the parent that we know, or this is where we have to call mom, or we have to call dad. We think about who else provides support within this network. And that can be a really good, that person can be a really good gatekeeper into that wider community dialogue or wider family dialogue. So that's part of, what we do. And I attended a training a little while ago about affluent neglect. And it was really interesting to see who was defined as appropriate family in terms of affluent neglect. So if a child was left in the care of someone who was not a mother or father, who was a paid employee, is that neglectful? Or is that just a different family dynamic? And there were a lot of assumptions made, again, about who constitutes a person's family. And it doesn't have to be blood, right? It could be other people within that context.
I'm not familiar with the term affluent
neglect.
Can you explain that term?
Sure. So neglect is often thought of as an economic, is a result of an economic situation. So you're neglectful because you can't afford to dress your child or feed your child in a particular way. But also there's a whole realm of neglect that happens because parents maybe or whoever is taking care of this child may have access to a lot of resources and overwhelm their child with those resources, and in a way that can also affect the child's development and care. So if their guardians are away often, or if they have access to everything and anything that they want at any time, that doesn't always serve the development of the child well. So neglect can be found on both ends of the spectrum when you look at the economics of it.
Yeah. Thank you. In our conversations, you've made some really interesting statements, which helped me to think a little bit more deeply about this whole area of safeguarding and child protection within a social context. And you say that safeguarding and child protection training needs to live in the grey, because you describe abuse as a social construct. So how do you create clarity about the unnegotiable bottom line? Every child has the right to be safe and must be protected from harm, and the ways in which we adapt for the diverse cultural sensitivities of our communities in international schools, because there isn't a way, there are many ways. And perhaps you could speak to that.
I think it's very, it can sound very controversial to say abuse is a social construct. Abuse is abuse, right? But I think that when you think about time and place and you start to frame it out that way, what we classify as abuse has changed dramatically over time. So for example, if you were, I'll give the example of like the UK, if you were in the UK 25 years ago, maybe, or 30 years ago, let's go back even further, and you were out at the park and your child did something and you gave them a little smack, maybe you wouldn't have gotten a second look. But if you did that today, I think you'd get a reaction from the majority of the people within that space. And I think the idea and the concept of what constitutes as appropriate parenting and discipline has changed dramatically. So again, if you rewind and you go back in time, changes were made in terms of the resources that parents had access to, or guardians and carers had access to, about what's an appropriate way to engage with a child, and then also what the long-term consequences of that is developmentally. So the appropriate way to parent a child, right? It exists on a spectrum, and it depends on the family's particular social, religious, cultural context and where you are in time and place. So the idea that it's a construct is really important, because if a parent is parenting the only way they know how, there's a lot of reproduction of cycles of maybe violence or trauma or things that they've experienced. So the important thing about staying in the gray is that when you judge people, you're ending a conversation, you're not beginning one. So it's really important to give people the opportunity to access other resources, to access other ways of parenting, or other ways of disciplining, or other ways of, but if we just cut it off and we assume that the intention there is always cruelty, I think you stop a conversation from progressing, and you stop people from accessing better tools to engage with their children, or to engage with whoever it is that they're dealing with. So the idea that it exists in the gray is especially for training, because in some contexts, for example, here, we don't have a legally defined threshold of what constitutes as child abuse. So again, the school has to determine a lot of cases, and wait, do we go to the police with this, or do we call the parent with this? And those things are very difficult to grapple with when you don't have, again, a legally defined, and even when you do have a legally defined definition, it can be very difficult to unpack what that means in that context. You know, when you know the parents, you know this, you assume that everyone has their child's best interest at heart, but this is the way that they're doing it. Well, how do we get them to do it a different way? Is a better conversation sometimes than just cutting them off and assuming that they, you know. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
I muted myself, sorry. That's so interesting, because within some cultures and some legal systems, you know, that we all operate in different legal landscapes, and the legal ramifications of local laws are, you know, really important that we know within the context of our international schools. But we've talked about the fact that there are different legal approaches to things like data privacy, to things like photography in public places, to and you've described over time, I think your example of Great Britain was a very interesting one, because yeah, when I was working in special educational needs in Great Britain, and we were protecting children from the kind of abuses in their homes, sometimes there had to be a decision there about, is it better though for them still to be able to stay within their family unit, or do we take them out of the family unit in order to in order to protect them from the danger? And they weren't easy conversations to have. But then when the law changed, then it was a question of, we don't even have to think about this. It's just going to be, it's just going to be a clear, get in the house, take the child out and get them out, you know. And so depending on which country you're in and what the local laws are, there may be a little bit more room for negotiation and support, and in others it becomes yeah, a different approach. But you know, the rules of consent, for example, are not the same universally, and who's regarded as an adult or the child within the cultural context of those different cultures in which we live.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the first things that we really had to understand is, what does it mean legally to be a child? Where is the cutoff? Because as well, within, for example, the Qatari context, a lot of children will live with their parents until they get married. So that may be 25, that may be 35, you know? And so again, that the complexity of your family unit again comes into play. So we had a lot of people come from around the world. Well, she's 16, she's an adult, she's 18, she's an adult, he's 21, he's an adult. And even that concept of like, when does adulthood begin is defined legally. So here as well as it is defined legally, but again, then the assumption is that consent and being an adult go together. And that's not always true, because if we're talking about, for example, sexual consent, well, there's no premarital sex. So again, you end up in this legal kind of, with a legal definition that doesn't necessarily fit what people's assumptions are about adulthood. And again, people bring in their own assumptions to a context, and they don't necessarily have the time, space, or energy to find out where the laws exist or where they can go and browse them or how they can find them. So within the legal dimension, what we had to do is really find out, okay, what are the laws? And one of those things is like, okay, well, we have to go and we have to find the law and we have to unpack what that law does for us. You know, how do we use this law to our advantage? So one of the key laws that we found is there's a law around family. So there's a family law, and that one will talk about spouses' rights and talks about children's rights to a healthy home environment. And you can use that to define kind of the parameters of your discussion. But there are no explicit child rights laws, for example, within Qatar. So you have to find them elsewhere. There's laws for citizens with special needs and their rights. So again, we leverage that in our discussion of understanding what the provisions need to be within the country and what support we should be getting within the country. Same with the data privacy laws. A lot of those required us to dive in, find out what they mean. And then also it becomes a piece of education for our students as well, for them to understand what consent means. And we've had a lot of discussions with this internally. It's something that we still culturally struggle to discuss in a wider forum, but it's really important to educate people about what those things mean, especially coming from different contexts where their actions may be deemed perfectly legal, but they can be reframed in a way that is very dangerous for them here. So I think that, getting students involved and parents involved in that discussion and then having authentic conversations with our expat community and our international teachers about that is really important. And one of the biggest things is, you can't let these topics become taboo. And, a lot of our differences are differences because of the silence that we allow to exist in that space. So, the bigger the silence is around the topic, the more differences are assumed. And it's better to unpack that and kind of avoid putting topics in a taboo box and not unpacking them. So I always say, if you're having a discussion with me about child protection, there's nothing is taboo, nothing is off the table. And you have to be as candid and as authentic as you can, especially around this. So if you get uncomfortable with these topics, maybe you shouldn't be a CPO. But it's really important to be, not to be, shy about delving into these uncomfortable topics. That's, living in the gray, living in that uncomfortable space, that's all part of it. And that's, again, when we go back to the training, it's so easy in a lot of trainings to be like, okay, well, step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3 is this, and I'm done. I've now passed it off to a social worker, or I've now passed it off to the policeman who's going to deal with it, or whoever that's going to investigate it. And in a lot of contexts, you don't necessarily have that external support. So you have to think a little bit more critically about what your next steps are and what your resources are.
Yeah, I think the whole area of taboos as well is just really helpful in having those challenging conversations to create the space and the climate for psychological safety, right? I'm just going to refer to our chat because Natalie's put a comment in and then she's asked a question as well. She says, it's so important to bring community into the conversation about culture. Such broad assumptions could be made about culture, but fewer assumptions can be made about unique communities. Thank you for expanding and thinking in this area. And then she asks a little bit later, and this was in respect of what you were just talking about. She says, is that the situation in Qatar right now, that there is no legal definition of child abuse?
Yeah, so that's, as of our current situation, that is what we have to deal with, is that there is no given legal definition. So there are the family laws that protect children's well-being in that space indirectly, right? So they say you have to be provided with a home. There has to be a level of stability within the home. It tells what the mother and father's rights are within that marriage and within a divorce situation or with the passing of one of the parents. So there is a lot about guardianship and about protection and about things like that, but it's all something that you have to use. So we use legal precedent a lot when we're trying to determine what to do next. So we, with things like custody and things that end up at your school's door, if two parents are both showing up to pick up a child, you need to know legally who has the right to come pick them up and what the agreements are. So we do a lot of work indirectly to try to work out what the best scenario is based on what the laws are. We found that the family law is the one that we refer to a lot, but we've also, like you've mentioned previously, like the data protection laws are really important and the privacy laws are really important, because situations where, for example, you have cyberbullying or you have like blackmail or students sending inappropriate pictures to each other that are now spread, it really becomes important for the students to understand the legal ramifications of what they're doing, because what they're doing is against the law, but also to have the evidence to support that. So that's something as well that has helped us a lot with child protection, is understanding that the laws may not directly say child protection or child rights, but they do indirectly provide us with that legal framework to support it. And I know that there's child rights laws in the pipeline, so we're hoping that something will be finalized soon and shared. It has become an increased topic of conversation within the country. There was a great conference 2 years ago now on child protection within the country. So there's a lot of development happening simultaneously. It's about connecting those pieces. And then also when you're in international school, you don't necessarily always have the resources to tap into something that may be happening in another language, or people that don't necessarily speak the same language as the majority of your staff. So having that again, the cultural capacity, the linguistic capacity to engage with your wider community is really important. One of the trainings I attended offered resources like a lawyer, PR, communications people that you could call for advice, but they were all based in the US. So again, how much of that legal advice is adaptable to my context? It's questionable that person would have all the expertise necessary. So again, it would serve the purposes of our accreditation and following a policy that we've imported, but it doesn't necessarily serve the wider purpose of supporting the community.
Yep, thank you for that. And I think we talked about this just before the call, that in some countries it is very clearly defined and it's very clear what the steps are, and so some of the trainings really reflect what those steps might be. However, the last 2 years have brought countries where there is this very clear definition into the same kind of complications where, yeah, you may have a child at home who's not opening up because they're sitting in front of a screen, and their family or extended family may be sitting very near to them. And the whole context has changed because of our ways of communication in the last couple of years. Can you perhaps speak a little bit to some of these impacts of the pandemic and the ways in which we've had to adapt our communication systems with one another?
I think one of the things that was always very, very clear, for example, in Qatar, was the private sphere and the public sphere were always very separate. So, what you did at school, what you did out at the mall, all of those things were kind of there for the public consumption. What you did at home was your own business. I think the pandemic really blurred that, because you were all of a sudden inviting, 15 odd kids and a couple of adults into your home every few hours. And I think it really blurred that line. And that creates a lot of interesting scenarios for both the adults in the space and the children in the space. And I think that one of the things that we've had to deal with is what do you do in that scenario? What do you do if you hear something in the background, or if a student puts something in the chat and you don't have access to that child right away, and you can't necessarily call someone to swoop in and save the day. And we know that a lot of social services around the world were very pressed when it came to serving their population's needs during a pandemic. So we've had to be very mindful of the recommendations that we put out, the support that we give. And that's one of the things as well, is that we know that people are dealing with a huge mental load anyways because of the pandemic. And one of the things that we think about is when we give trainings that say do 1, 2, 3, and then your job is done, but a lot of our staff do 1, 2, 3 and feel like their job is still not done. That child is still in their school. They still don't know if that child is safe. That also adds to the mental load that person is carrying and the emotional load that they're carrying. So we have to think a lot about that, we provide our students with, counselors and psychologists and people to support them, but we don't necessarily develop that same robust system of support for the adults in our space that are doing this work. And when we think about the level of ambiguity that they're dealing with and the amount of pressure that that can put on them, that's really something that I think is the next step for child protection, is about thinking about the adults in our space who are dealing with these things. So, seeing a distressing comment is just as distressing for the adult in that space as it is for the other children. And then the children have an adult to rely on, or they have a counselor that can follow up with, but we need to take care of our adults in this space as well. And I think the pandemic has really brought to light that the enormous amount of pressure that we put on our adults in this space to be everything to everyone. And, they don't all have the training to be the counselor and the social worker and the principal and, part-time mom when they need to be. And, they probably have like something on the stove and they have like papers to mark and they have all these other things because they're at home as well. And I think that really exposed a lot of vulnerability. And I think that ties into the safeguarding and child protection realm enormously. And one of the things that we recommended at the beginning of the pandemic was to keep an at-risk register. So know who your students are, who you've identified as vulnerable, who may be in volatile home situations, and who maybe that the situation may exacerbate that further. So like the at-risk register recommendation came out really early, and it's something that we've pushed for throughout. But again, different schools have different levels of capacity to do that level of follow-up and to build that relationship with the parents and to be aware of what the needs are. So it really is, it's an ongoing situation. And again, with those beautiful prepackaged trainings that give you those clear 1, 2, 3s, don't always get adapted very well for situations like this. So we have to think about counseling. What does counseling look like online? Because we tell our teachers, no one-to-one. We don't want anyone to be one-to-one with a student online. It's just not a very safe way to operate. But for counselors, they're used to being one-to-one with their students. They're dealing with highly sensitive situations. So what do we tell our counselors to do in this instance when they've moved online? So we've had to think really creatively about how to create safe spaces for the adults and the children when they're operating online.
It's so important, isn't it? This support for the supporters, as it were.
Yeah.
How we've noticed at ECIS, an increase in the number of people that are really interested in mindfulness and well-being courses. And during this time in particular, I think it has emphasized that the social and emotional, perhaps the spiritual aspects of a child and us as educators, are not a nice to have. They're a really important foundation for being able to be healthy learners. What are some of the ways in which you are supporting your supporters?
Well, we're really trying to find out more about what it means to be a member of our community. And one of the things that we realize is that we do a lot of quantitative data measuring, about a lot of things that aren't necessarily like our staff well-being. I see one of my colleagues is on the call, and we're actually working on like a well-being survey. So something that speaks to the well-being of our staff, our students, and our parents. So a lot of it is based on perception. So how do you perceive the environment around you? How do you perceive your belonging or your membership in this community? So, questions around like, I feel safe at school, I feel supported, I have someone to go to, someone will check in on me if I miss work or if I miss school. And questions like that are data points that we weren't really collecting. And they are really important to do on a wide scale and to do systematically. So that is something that we're doing. And I think that data will inform a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we have, because I think the pandemic has provided us with lots of anecdotal evidence about the importance of well-being, the importance of supporting people in these spaces. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to kind of give real robust data, right? To be able to present the policies and procedural changes that you'd like. So that's something that we're working on. And I always say that the core bit of it is child protection, right? You have to have the ability to react to something that happens in your environment. The preventative piece is your safeguarding, which is the little shell that goes around it. So it's your policies, your procedures, the things that you do. But ultimately, you want the well-being circle to cover all of it. And that is really that piece around empowerment, around agency, around making sure that you're not just getting ahead of it, that you're giving people the tools to run with it. And that means creating structural changes and spaces for people to be able to engage in these mindfulness practices, or these, because if people are really pressed and feel like they don't have the time, space, or support to do that, it really is not fair to tell them, like, go meditate for 15 minutes, you'll feel fine, when they don't have 15 minutes to spare. So creating that space to allow them to have 15 minutes here, or, support in another space, will allow them that ability to do. And going back to the pandemic, I think that that's one of the things that we found with child protection at the start of the school year, when children were back in our building. There was a huge influx of disclosures of children just telling us all these things that happened, or all these things that they were feeling. And I feel like a lot of it came down to parents who may have had, like, or caregivers that had 4 or 5 tools in their toolbox, were really burnt down to one. And, a parent that may have never yelled was yelling, and a parent that may have never, ever, even given a smack on the bottom to a child, is all of a sudden doing that. And we have to think about the adults in our space and their mental health and their well-being. And a lot of them were really stripped down to, there was a lot of, like, surprise of, like, no, I can't believe that this child or this home or this place would be volatile. And a lot of people were really stripped down to their bare minimum resources in terms of their ability to cope with the stresses at home. And again, that's why I always think about, like, how do we nudge people in a different direction instead of judging them? And how do we re-equip that toolbox? How do we replenish it so that they feel that they can deal with this? Children were falling asleep during class, they were exhausted, and parents were frustrated that their children were falling asleep during class, and there was so much screen time, and there was so much to do, and parents and students, and they weren't necessarily coping well with being everything at once. In a school building, you get to be a student and the teacher gets to be a teacher. But at home, you could be the teacher and the mom, and looking after your pet, and cooking lunch and doing all of those things at once. So you don't get to wear just one hat, and that really strips you down. And the students are the same thing. They have siblings walking in and out. They could have pets walking in and out. They could have parents walking in and out. They're all sharing the same internet. They could be sharing the same device. So we have to think a lot about what that does in terms of your resources as well, to be able to be that mindful, positive parenting, forward, like, thinking and inclusive practice advocating person, when you're really stripped down to, I'm trying to function.
So right, I mean, we just yes, it's a real struggle to try and keep perfect all the way through, right?
Yeah.
And I know that within schools as well, we were at the beginning of the pandemic, we were talking about we just have to be permission giving about the fact that we won't get everything done, and we won't be, and then those were the sort of survival skills that we were using that work when you've got a crisis that lasts 3 weeks or something. But then as each month went by, we were beginning to say, well, why hasn't that happened, and why haven't we done that? And then you forget all the permission giving about, will it just get done, and you start going back into those default behaviors of, we haven't got things done, we need to move on. And so people, I think, were certainly at the beginning experiencing new behaviors perhaps in themselves, as you describe, people who may never have shouted at a child, and then finding themselves to be doing that, and then were frightened by their own kind of reactions. But I'm encouraged by the fact that you're talking about this in the past, because it sounds as if Qatar is probably in a better situation than some other parts of the world, where people are still out of school or out of school again, and those sort of fears about the whole thing just going on endlessly, as it were. And then other places where it's opening up, and people are feeling a kind of a relief of being able to move out of some of that sort of collective depression, perhaps. I'm going to just move on in my next question to asking, sort of moving on a little bit from our theme and our subject here of child protection and safeguarding, just to think about other assumptions, because I think you highlight through the kind of trainings that you talk about that where we do need to be really conscious of and sensitive to cultural contexts when we're working with each other, to the kind of assumptions that are made perhaps about cultures that we've had little contact with, and I think you've helped us to understand some really interesting aspects of Qatar. but the assumptions that we make as we travel around the world to different parts of the world that can lead to vulnerabilities and misunderstandings. And one such example might be the idea of the Arabic speaking world, as if everybody in an Arabic speaking world speaks one language, which of course is not necessarily the case. Also, I think some of your work that has over the years, which has been involved in sort of dispelling some of the myths about Arabic women. And I'd just love you to highlight some of your experiences in this respect.
Well, I think we all have within us a lot of unconscious bias that we have to be very active and mindful in unpacking. I think it's really important when you butt up against something that takes you by surprise to ask yourself, why was that surprising? Why was I surprised that this person could do X, or this person is here or there, or wherever they may be? I think that that's something that's really powerful and that you have to constantly do. For the Arabic speaking world, and I think people who may be new to it, I think there is an assumption of a very monolithic, homogenous approach to family, to culture, to the way that people practice sort of their religion or express their cultural belonging. And I think that the longer that people spend in the region, they realize just how different it could be, even from one household to another, that maybe within the same family, there's such huge differences. And one of the things that I found really powerful was actually speaking to a counselor who recently left our context, but talking to her about her impressions. And one of the things that she was really surprised about was perception around gender roles, especially, and then also gender performativity. And that's something that I find really, really interesting, because I think people assume that everything is very black and white. And that there's like strict ways to express your gender belonging. And I think that people aren't necessarily always prepared for what that looks like when, and we literally dress in black and white. So again, when we talk about gender performativity and like gender norms, and people aren't always prepared for what the reality looks like. And I think with that counselor, what she was talking about was the understanding of gender performativity and sexuality, and the way that they can come together, but they can also be two very different things. And having students who are, being challenged because of the way that they were exhibiting or performing their gender, and having their sexuality questioned. And they were really uncomfortable with that. And there was a lot of really productive and powerful discussion that happened both with the students and with the parents around that she was completely unprepared for, because she was told that the topic is so taboo that she'll never have to deal with it. Like, the kids here don't have those problems. Like, kids here don't have problems with substance abuse. Kids here don't have problems with sexuality or gender performance or gender performativity or their sense of identity in that way. And I think that rigidity is more projected onto a lot of the culture here than it is inherent to the culture. There's a fluidity in a lot of what was done in terms of like dress, in terms of, gender roles. There was a lot more fluidity. And I think that the projection of very strict gender norms from a lot of outside eyes, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy that was put in place rather than the reality of the culture. So there's a lot of really interesting challenges that emerge when you're thinking about bias, when you're thinking about, again, a lot of the areas that may be considered taboo. And our parents have had to adapt and deal with a lot of change in a very short amount of time. So like, again, going back to my example of the first school opening did not have air conditioning. So like we have that date of like the school got air conditioning 2 years later because they were granted electricity for X amount of hours. To don't forget your tablet, and like, don't forget to log on to the Google Classroom and download the Zoom and do all of these things. So our parents have had to make those adjustments from like, yay, we get an air conditioning for 2 hours of school versus, make sure you have your tablet ready and make sure you've got all these apps downloaded, and don't forget, your class dojo and your whatever. So our parents have had to adapt to a lot and have had to adjust a lot. And I think that sometimes there's just a little bit of lag, with that sort of cultural understanding or that parenting understanding that we can help facilitate as a school. And I think, again, if we judge parents, then we're pushing them out of our space rather than involving them in that conversation.
We're back to that danger of a single story again, aren't we?
Exactly.
We have to see our world and each other with these multiple stories that are so important. I'm going to just, sorry, go on.
And I think it's particularly dangerous with child protection to have those assumptions that those things don't happen here. Because again, you may be missing like signs and or behavior changes in students that would maybe very easily be identified elsewhere because they understand that the children are at risk of X, Y, and Z, and they don't necessarily have that same belief within this context. So you're also ruling out support that you could be providing for people. And back to that vulnerability point, like I'm always in two minds of like, are people inherently vulnerable or are systems designed without them in mind, making them vulnerable? And I think there's a tension there as well, because in a lot of training, we talk about, you know who your vulnerable populations are, know who your at-risk kids are, but are they at risk and vulnerable inherently, or because the system is designed with them on the outside?
That's a very interesting question. Very interesting question. I'm going to just refer to something that Alex has put into the chat. So Alex says, I find that often parents want to help their child, but don't always know how to do so. There have been times when they call and I can hear their frustration because they've never been required to be around their child all day and help them learn. This is what you were speaking to, right? Yeah. I agree that in order to help the students, we have to create professional development for parents on how to support their children. At times, they've become more appreciative of what teachers do daily for their children. This is so right. There's so many, certainly when I was in my previous headship, appreciative parents just saying, I get it now. And just being so appreciative of what the teachers do. Meeting with the parents in person and giving them some tips has been incredibly beneficial for our students, Alex says. Thank you for suggesting that helping those that support the students is crucial. We're stronger as a larger community. So lovely comments in response to what you were talking about there. Yeah.
And I think if we take this as well and apply it maybe just a little bit broader to the child protection lens, we've also seen parents who are trying to help their children through maybe, natural remedies or home treatments or cultural treatments of things that they really need to be diagnosed and supported with medically. And again, in some contexts, that would be labeled as abuse. But for some parents, this is what they know. This is what they believe will help their child. So having those conversations can be really important to understand, okay, so this is a homeopathic, remedy that you have within this context. Okay, that's great, but here's another alternative, that is based in science that may be more supportive and help your child further. So especially with things that parents don't always understand around mental health, that can be really helpful, like things like ADHD or even depression. In a lot of religious communities, depression is something that's very hard to diagnose and deal with. It's a lack of faith, it's a lack of, so parents really tend to go back to their toolbox again. And if we're not helping them expand that toolbox and better equip it, then they end up falling into patterns of behavior that we don't necessarily want to support. So again, being aware of the spectrum is really important, and being aware of what people are resorting to in different contexts is really powerful.
Just expanding the capacity for those support networks and for the tools that they can be using. Yeah. So we're moving swiftly, whether you believe it or not, we're moving swiftly towards the end of our hour, as it were. And Susan has just put something in the chat, so I'm going to refer to that now, where she says, I'm used to sending newsletters to parents highlighting the importance of positive parenting, parent coaching approaches, etc. However, I have a question regarding the law in Qatar. In case any child was physically abused by their own parents, is there a law that protects the child?
So the law is there's no specific law that addresses that. Again, because the separation of the private and public sphere are, it's a very powerful thing. There's only those overarching laws that we can look up, let's say the health and safety and things like that. But there are like helplines that you can call, and there are social police as well, networks that you can call that will help facilitate like a social worker visiting or put in place an agreement plan with parents around like, you know, attending counseling or doing certain things. So there is a level of intervention, but it's not to the degree in some cases where we see, in some countries where we see the child just removed from that context immediately. And that, again, is something that our child protection officers sometimes really struggle with, you know, emotionally and psychologically, to say, okay, well, I'm going to call and report this. Then the support that they're going to get is long-term support that is, you know, capacity building or a warning letter or something like that. But that child is still in that situation. So I think that there's sometimes a tension between wanting immediacy in terms of the response that you would get, and also then building that capacity. So how, you know, we all have the best interest of the child at heart. And I think that sometimes it can be very difficult to make that call because you know that child will be left in that environment. So what if you've made a risky situation more risky? So that's one of the things that, again, in the training, it says you pick up the phone and you call. But in reality, is it important for us to have a conversation with the parents to understand the situation, maybe to extend a hand of support or to, you know, give them other tools? Or do you just make that call and knowing that you're sending that child home to that situation? So it's a really valid question. We have seen students removed from their, or, you know, individuals removed from their context and moved to a different family member. But again, if the issue is like cutting off access, that doesn't always, you know, remove the access right away. And it depends on the severity and the degree of what you're seeing as well. So there's a huge spectrum.
I think from countries and cultures where there is a law, it kind of sounds shocking that the country doesn't have a law. However, I live in Germany, and we have a very clear law, but given a situation, I may contact the social services and say, we've got a really troubling situation here, and I'm reporting it, and we really need something to happen there. And they'll say, well, the family's got our contact details if they need us. And I'm kind of surprised by that, because I'm saying, no, I'm not really asking them to contact you if they need you. I'm saying we need to do something about the child. It's nebulous. It's always going to be open. Well, unless it's as you say, unless it's a culture where we have enough evidence to suggest that we now need to remove the child from the home, and that's it. So even if you do have a country where there is a very clear law, you'll still be entering into what is the best thing for this situation, and how does this work in this context.
And one of the things we're advocating for very strongly as well is to introduce social workers to our schools. So that's something on a national level that happens in our public schools. So our public schools do have social workers embedded within their systems that help support teachers that are dealing maybe with disclosures of abuse and things like that. But that's something that we want to encourage for international schools as well, is that even if you don't have a full-time social worker embedded within your school, that you can contact a social worker for advice, that you can contact a lawyer for advice, that you can, you know, reach out to different stakeholders or different key experts within your context for the appropriate support in those situations, because that can make a huge difference in terms of navigating how to best deal with a case.
You mentioned earlier that there is in the pipeline this child's rights that's coming through. Where time is marching on, but I'd like to mention what Natalie has put in the chat, where she says, what you're sharing makes me think of relationship mapping strategy from Harvard's Making Caring common project. The idea is for schools to carry out an exercise to make students' relationships with trusted adults, ensuring students have at least one adult with whom they can talk. It helps identify students at risk. And she's actually put a link in into the chat there. Yeah. And then she puts an addendum afterwards, make students' relationships with adults more visible. Sorry, that's what she meant there. It helps to look for positive connections between adults and students. That's really helpful to have that in there as well. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. We're going to sort of wrap up now, but I think you've really helped to pose some fascinating questions and to keep what I see as being a dialogue which keeps open. That what you're helping me to understand anyway is that in many of our decisions in life, but specific to safeguarding and child abuse, we may believe that we have clear laws, but we're still open to question because it's about relationship building. And what we're wanting to do is not to point the finger and condemn so much as, you talk about nudging, so much as to be able to support a transformation for better change. And at some point that may be that we have to remove a child from a situation. And but there may be many steps before that decision is made. And which I'm also drawing from what you're talking about here is that our cultural setting has as many shades of grey, even though you wear black and white in Qatar, that we need to be so careful about our assumptions and our only adhering to or listening to a single story or noticing a single story, but it's all about that relationship building, isn't it? And I'm so grateful for the fact that you've taken this time with us today, but that also that you're going to be leading this course 2 hours on 3 different weeks during February, starting on February the 2nd. And we're just, was it February the 2nd that we're starting?
It's a Wednesday. That's what I know.
It's on the CIS website. Yes, indeed. And it's Wednesday the 2nd. And so thank you. People know that they can contact you and us at ECIS. Take a look at the website because it's on the website, and you can sign up to it there if you're interested in that course. But the dialogue must continue, or the conversation must continue. It's such valuable thinking, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to you for being here with us today. Thank you. And to the people that have been popping their comments in the chat. I apologize if we haven't got to the point that you've made in the chat today, but thank you everybody, and have a lovely rest of the day, morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you.
Al-Jawhara, thank you so much for this very interesting conversation today.
Thank you.